Wanted to start off, just our outline today. We're going to look at plagiarism defenses to avoid. Taken several students to the honor board before, here and at other universities, and sat on them as a witness, and very unpleasant experiences. So just want to talk about that for a second. Then we're going to talk about basic ground rules for incorporating sources into your own work. And so and then a toolkit you're going to use for incorporating sources. And we're really wanting to focus mainly on how do you evaluate sources, what are the techniques used to integrate them, not so much what is plagiarism and don't do this, don't do that. It's more what do you do, okay? But we are going to start off with current events. And I'm sure all of you have seen the side-by-side speech sections from the National Convention. How many of you think this is plagiarism? Okay. And why would you say it was plagiarism, sir?
Because the similarities are, I mean, it's almost word for word in many phrases, and although some words were changed, it didn't significantly change the content of the original.
Okay, very good, yes. Word for word, strings of words are the same. That's an excellent point. And a few words were changed here and there, but not many. The other point to make, which I think you were alluding to, is that the concepts are the same throughout, right? And they're in the same order. So the chances of someone stringing words together in a sentence is fairly rare if you go to 4 or 5 words. But when you get in a sentence more words than that, unlikely. But when you have whole sentences falling one after the other, it's unlikely that we would organize our thoughts in exactly the same way. Okay, so those are things to keep in mind when you're working. All right, so here are some common defenses that I found coming out of numerous people were talking about when this issue came up, and they're the same ones I hear on honor boards, or when a student comes to us with a draft paper and I say, yeah, you need to change this because otherwise if you turn it in, it'll be plagiarized. But in an honor board, you often hear the student say, no, it wasn't plagiarism. I wrote it myself. I'm an honorable person. Why would you think I'd ever do that? And since I'm an honorable person, it's unfathomable. Well, we do have a U.S. Senator and a decorated Army colonel who was caught plagiarizing his final paper for the Army War College and lost his seat in Congress as a result of that. It was about 5-6 years after his paper, and he also lost his degree. So he was a person well honored, but it didn't work out so well. It was great writing a beautiful speech. How could it be plagiarized? Not really that's kind of non sequitur, but you hear that all the time. It was well written, so it can't, and that's all that matters is also what we hear. Well, we wrote it. It sounds good. It's okay. We often hear that it matters whether it was intentional or not. Do you believe it matters whether it is intentional or not?
Well, by definition, it doesn't matter if it's intentional or not. If you don't give credit or use quotation marks or cite, it is plagiarism.
Right. It doesn't matter if it was intentional. It may if you're on at an honor board and they are giving punishments, they may adjudicate that. But you are responsible for keeping track of your sources, taking good notes, citing where you need to cite. And in a thesis, you may have 1 or 2 places where you forgot. That is not such a big deal, but it's when you have much more that it's bigger deal. Then we get down to only small percent of the total. We have had theses that come back from the Turn It In program, which analyzes plagiarism. They may be 21% matching, but all of them are false positives because there are a lot of proper nouns in their report that torn up because they're longer than 4 words. Or they're using Chicago Notes bibliography, so all their footnotes show up as plagiarized. So those are all false positives, that's okay. We've had theses, though, that are only about 2% plagiarized, and there's some a whole page taken from Wikipedia. So the first one is not a problem at 21%. The second one is, right? So percent does not matter. Okay. So there are a number of other things down here to look at, but even the one on Europeans don't know about plagiarism. You could insert Middle Eastern, Asian, whatever you want. We hear that excuse a lot, but with we actually find that international students pay a lot of attention to this issue and do better than the American students, at least at NPS. Okay, and that's about it. Those are things we hear from all the time. It's a visor's fault. It was the team member's fault, etc. So, okay, so I am going to turn things over to Greta now, and she is going to go through the rules, the basic rules, and then we'll get into massaging.
So we brought up the plagiarizing thing just because obviously that's the point of this class, but we don't want to hammer you on plagiarizing. What we want to do is help you know how to avoid it by doing things in a more appropriate manner and understanding the rules of how to track the information and how to use the information. So we've kind of organized these, as Sandy said, by rules. So when you're using sources, first thing you need to think about is what's the validity and the source of the information? Where did it come from? What do you know about it? So as you're researching, trying to find sources, you need to make sure they're valid, and then you need to use them and write about and give the credibility to it. So the purpose of this guide is to try and give you kind of an overview. You'll see there's different categories up there. Is it written content? Is it written word? Is it spoken? How is it found? And the color coding, the green, are to give you a sense of those are the resources that are most often going to be valid. You always have to verify, but those are going to be the more reliable sources. And then the orange ones are where there's potentially mixed reliability. Where you talk about academic sources, they're pretty much always going to be considered reliable. New sources, as you know, on the other hand, well, that kind of depends. Where it came from, who is it from, what's their point of view, what do you know about it? So the idea here is just to kind of help you know what kinds of things to pay attention to use more of, but as you use some of those other things, because you'll still need to use opinions and TV pieces and things like that potentially, to know that you have to do a lot more work and you have to give it a little bit more credibility or not use it if it's not. And we feel like Sandy has a PhD, I have 2 masters, and so we've done a lot of research and done a lot of writing in our various areas. And we feel like that research is kind of like cooking. Writing is kind of like cooking because you need to think through what is it that you want. Are you in a hurry? You know, you go home from school and you're hungry and you haven't thought through for the week what you want to do and you grab whatever you can get your hands on. That's kind of like your ramen and Pop-Tarts, which kind of equates to, oh, I'm going to get everything I need from Google or Wikipedia. But ideally, because this is an academic process and you're going to be writing papers and ultimately writing a thesis or some sort of a research paper or professional paper, depending on the program that you're in, that you really ought to be thinking ahead. You need to have a plan. What is it that I want to search? What's my topic? How am I going to find the information? Where do I need to go to get it? What do I need to do to capture the information? Then how do I put it together? I don't want just any old sources. I want quality ingredients. I need to kind of think about who my audience is or who are my dinner companions so that I can ensure that I'm writing the type of information and collecting the type of information. Sometimes that means going to specialty stores or databases. And then pulling your information together, pulling your recipe together, and testing it, looking for what's out there. Does it work? How does it taste? Any good cook will tell you as they go along, they're tasting what they've cooked to make sure. Does it have enough salt? Does it have enough sugar? Does it have the right mix of ingredients? So you want to add the right proportions because, you know, if you're a cook, most cooks would know that some things it doesn't matter. You can kind of throw them all and mix them all up like a salad and you're fine. Other things, if you're trying to make a souffle, it matters what order you put the ingredients in, and it can create a wonderful product or it can create a flop. So these are some of the things, and then ultimately, obviously, you want to add the right resources. You want to add your own tone, your own voice to what you're doing. This relates very well to, as you're doing your research, how are you capturing the information? Not just how is it going to end up in the paper, but how are you keeping track of all that information so that you have quick access back to it? So rule number 2, when you're incorporating those sources, you always need to make clear where the information came from. So rule number 1 involves finding the resources and capturing the information about it. Rule number 2 has to do with, okay, now I'm writing and I want to bring that information into my paper or my thesis. How do I do that so I make it very clear what's my words and what's somebody else's words or thoughts? The assumption is everything in your paper is your own unless you've told the reader otherwise. So you need to tell the reader, and that includes, as it says, not just words, but thoughts and analysis, graphs, charts, things like that that you might have created for yourself. Everything else is, if you've told your reader that something belongs somewhere else, it's assumed to be your own unless it's exempt, and we'll talk in a little bit about what does that mean, what's exempt. It's really important to use signal phrases and citations. So signal phrases mean you're telling the reader, this is where this information came from. I'm going to be using somebody else's words, thoughts, and then I'm going to tell you where it came from by virtue of the citation, so that you are clarifying throughout the reading what's yours, what's theirs. Ideally, you want to interweave a mix. It's not all about straight quotations of everything. That gets really old, it gets very boring, it messes up the flow of what you're doing. To quote something means to take their words directly, verbatim. To paraphrase means it's something much bigger and I don't want to use the whole thing, but I do want to kind of give a sense of what it was. I want to reword it so that it fits in with how I write, my style of voice rather than theirs. Summarizing means I'm going to take something that's really large and I'm going to give you a very quick, in a paragraph or less, here's what this thing was about, here's what the article was about, here's what the book was about. No matter which one of those I use, however, I still have to give credit. They weren't my words, even though I may have reworded something, it wasn't my idea, it wasn't my thought. So I have to give credit. And obviously you want to engage your reader. You want to tell them, this is the point of your paper, is to tell them what you're thinking, what your research has led you to. So you're going to explain, you're going to describe, you're going to justify what you're incorporating, and you're going to explain how all that relates back to your topic, your thesis statement. And if you have questions or you're not sure, always give credit to someone else, because if it's not your work and you don't, that's where you run into the whole issue of plagiarism. So rule number 3, you need to know what doesn't need to be cited. How do you know that? Well, this chart is helpful for that. First question is, did you think it, write it, draw it, gather it, or observe it? If you did, you don't have to cite it. It's yours. If you say, well, no, I didn't, then your next question is that information common knowledge? If it is common knowledge, you don't have to cite it. If it's not common knowledge, the next question is it field specific? Is the information known in my field, even though it might not be known in another field? We have NSA, we have MOVES, we have business, we have electrical engineering. What's known in each of your fields isn't necessarily known in the other fields. So if the answer to any of those questions is no, ultimately you do have to cite it. So what's common knowledge? Well, those are facts. Those are observable things. The moon rises in the east. Happens no matter where you are in the world. That's observable. Barack Obama has been the president of the US since 2008. Don't have to cite that. Commonly reported facts also don't have to be cited. We know that on September 11th, a number of planes were diverted and ended up in several buildings and in a field. Don't have to cite that. That is not in dispute. However, some of the information around it might be in dispute. If there are conspiracy theorists who disagree with it, then you would want to cite them and what they're disagreeing with. In the case of the World Trade Center, if you were trying to cite statistics of how many people died, those statistics changed minute by minute according to where we were in the day, when the buildings came down. They subsequently changed as people died as a result of the events. They also, people died, the rescue people died. So those would be things that you would want to cite because that's a moment in time where things changed quite a bit. There were a lot of statistics that came out about how many people died in the airplanes. And then they started citing them based on how many terrorists there were versus how many passengers and crew. So you can see where those things actually can get off of the known or observable, and in those cases you do want to cite them. If you're not sure, ask your professor, ask the writing center coaches, come and ask the librarians. Field specific, you wouldn't have to cite this. Any golfers? You've all seen a golf ball. You know that they have little dimples in them versus a ping pong ball that doesn't have dimples. Well, the purpose of that is because in physics, that helps reduce drag. So it helps the flight of the ball. Well, if you didn't golf or you weren't in physics, you wouldn't necessarily know that. If you're in that field and it's known in that field, then you don't have to cite it because your audience is people in that field. Political science. Sandy has a political science background. You have a question?
Just a quick question with that. Yeah, so what if you're not in the field, but you're writing for that field? You personally didn't know it, but everybody else in the field knows it. Would you cite that?
If you're writing in somebody else's field for that field, then no, because it would be known within that field.
Okay.
If you were taking information that was known in your field and try to apply it to somebody else's field where they wouldn't know that, then yes, you would want to cite it.
Okay, because you would let someone else in the other field know that, hey, this is where this info is from.
And chances are, part of the review process, if somebody didn't know terminology or things that you were using, they would question it. And that becomes, when in doubt, cite it. In the political science world, it's known that China became a communist state in 1949. Other people may not know that, but the political sciences are going to be writing in their areas. Also in the sciences, when you use theories and methods, while you might describe the theory that you're using, you don't have to cite it to say this is where it came from. But you would want to at least give it a description because different theories, different fields use different theories. So you do want to explain what theory you are using. But again, if you have different sources that are disagreeing, then you are going to want to cite them and talk about why they disagree. This is for the purposes of citation, and as we go through this briefing, we will talk about things and we will have citations embedded, and they will be a mix of Chicago and APA. So we try to have a little bit of both. But in the library, we have on our webpage a guide to how to cite, and the basic link is up there. And you'll notice across here, we have all of the basic citation styles that are used primarily here at NPS, occasionally some others. If you're not sure what citation style to use, there's a PDF form there that tells you from the different departments what their preference is. And then if you go to the site, and let me actually, one of the things that we have is, and this is taking us directly to the Chicago Notes and Bibliography, which is what NSA typically uses. You'll notice, as well as a link to the manual itself, we also have this section where we have actual citation examples. So as we scroll down the page, you'll notice it'll say something like N, which means footnote, B, which means bibliography. So for you in particular, because you have to do that, that's what that's telling you. And it's also telling you when a bibliography entry isn't needed, and that typically applies to legal information. So we've pulled all that out of the style manuals. Same thing applies to APA, IEEE, where we have guides that will help you know what citation style you should use. If you're not familiar with it, I recommend you take a look at it because that will be helpful to you as you're gathering your information. You know, what do I need to collect about that source? So that if you borrowed a book from the library, for example, and you had to return it, you would want to know, okay, what are the pieces of information I need to collect as well as what I'm using? And you can see we have all different kinds of things based on the different types of material you might be using. So we can just close that. So in your toolkit, we're talking about 3 tools. We're talking about quoting, paraphrasing, and summarizing. But there's only one formula, which is nice, makes it easy. So the formula is you want to start with a signal phrase indicating what it is, introducing what it is that you're going to do, what you're using, where it came from, along with an action verb. You want to, if you're quoting, you would put open quote to indicate, okay, this is the start of the words that I've taken from someone else. If you're paraphrasing or summarizing, you wouldn't do that. You're then going to insert that, whatever it is, whether it's a quote, paraphrase, or summary, and then you're going to end it. Again, if it's a quote, you're going to do close quotes. If it's a paraphrase or summarizing, you're going to insert the citation to it based on the style that you're using and then the requirements of it. And then you'll have the full citation in your list of references when you're done. And then you're going to write about what you included and why, so that you say, I didn't just plunk this, I didn't take it out of the blue and stick it in my paper because it sounded good. I'm putting it in there because of the value that it brings to what I'm talking about. So how do you know when you should quote, summarize, or paraphrase? Well, this graph, and you'll notice we're trying to be good and provide you with all the appropriate citations. So when you have information that's clear and accessible and short, few words, then you're probably going to want to quote. If your information isn't clear or very complex or written in a way that doesn't match your style of writing, then you're probably going to want to paraphrase it. And if it's long, you're going to want to summarize it rather than paraphrasing. Because paraphrasing is basically going to be about the same number of words, except that you're changing it up. Summarizing is you're going to take something very big and bring it down into a very small number of words. And there are some things that sometimes it's easier to divide it up into quotes or summarize. So now for you, which tool is best? An hour-long speech by Donald Trump. You want to use it. How are you going to use it?
The whole speech?
The whole speech.
I would say summarize.
Okay? I would summarize, or maybe if there's some pithy comments that you want to address, you could pull out specific quotes. What about a short paragraph introducing the DoD policy on marijuana now that there's a lot of state laws changing? How would you use that? Sorry?
Paraphrasing?
Paraphrasing? Okay.
It's a short paragraph. I would say quote. It seems like it would be fairly clear, and if it's short, it would be just a few words.
Okay. Short is, you have to kind of define. Short would be, a paragraph could be quite lengthy, in which case if you chose to summarize the whole thing or to quote the whole thing, there's a different style for that. If it's a sentence or two, yeah, it's in the same line. If it's longer than that, you've got to do blocked, indented, and set off. In most cases, probably paraphrase, but you could, depending on how short really is. A book on finding and killing Osama bin Laden.
Summarize.
I think I would summarize that. A description of how the internet use has evolved. What did you say?
Quote.
Quote?
Quote.
You would quote? You don't think the description would be pretty lengthy?
You cannot find.
I would probably summarize it. Again, I might pull out specific quotes, but typically a description on something is a little longer than what you would actually want to quote. One line from an anti-apartheid speech from Nelson Mandela. Pretty easy on that one, we're going to quote. An interview, the response to an interview from a former Marine fighting ISIS under a Kurdish commander. Maybe summarized, depending on how long.
Maybe some quotes.
Maybe some quotes. any one of these or all of these because you don't know how long, we haven't determined how long is the interview, how long was the response. And it would depend on what parts of it we wanted to take out. So, but yeah, you get the idea of when you need to decide which one to use. So now Sandy's going to start talking about signal phrases, and we're going to give you a handout of some signal phrases that will help you as you're writing.
Okay, so signal phrases are really handy. They introduce the writer to who is going to speak next. They're assuming it's you until you tell them otherwise. So you're going along, and then you're going to introduce your speaker. So you'll say, according to the FAA, blah, 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 blah. And that could be the blah, 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 blah could be a paraphrase, a quote, or a summary. But you've indicated to your reader who is going to be speaking. And that is very, very important. So your reader, it triggers a shift in their mind. Okay? And the other thing it does is it gives you a justification for using the source. If I'm talking about drone policy, and I'm saying the FFA, I said according to the FFA, that makes sense, right? If I was talking about drone policy, but I said according to the Drug Administration, that may not be relevant, right? So your source will tell your reader, signal to your reader whether or not what is coming next is quality, right? Okay, and the other thing it does with the signal phrase is it indicates what the source is doing, and that's very important. The source does something. And you have a sheet with you here now that goes over some of the verbs that are common for signal phrases. There are multiple actions possible. It can get very, very boring if all you said is the FFA said, Michelle Obama said, President of Turkey said, right? Okay, that gets pretty boring. So if you do want to indicate that someone said something, you have 20 different verbs here that you can use as a replacement for the word said. Okay, change it up. If someone is arguing in favor of something, right, which is different than just saying something, you're arguing for something. If they're arguing against a position, you want to indicate that they're arguing against it. This is really important for keeping the source material in context with what you're doing. Okay, so if you use these verbs and it will also help your language in terms of not having to cite every sentence. Okay, so you can say the FFA described its new policy on drones, but for private citizens in the United States. And the FFA continued, blah, 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 blah. So by mixing it up, you can say you don't have to use a citation after every single one. You're indicating by your signal phrase that the same speaker is continuing to speak, right? You've not introduced your other material. Okay, so let me show you how signal phrases work. Mainly what you want to do is you look at the source and you want to pull out from the source who said it, wrote it, or created it. That is important. What is the source type? Greta had that chart up there that showed that it could be a speech, a database, a computer code, whatever it is, right? Opinion, TV show, etc., web page. So you do want to know what the source type is, where and when was it published, and what did the source do? Did they argue something? Did they dispute? Did they disprove, right? And then you want to think about why do we care about the source and what they had to say. So this is a book by Kenneth Calmer, and he is, on the book cover, which you can easily get on Amazon.com, you can get information on that person if you don't know the writer, and it's not an academic source. If it's an academic source, an academic article you may just say, okay, I don't need to know the background of the scholar. It's not as important. But when it's something from a more popular press like Penguin Books, you want to know the background of the speaker. You're evaluating the source. So this is a book called Surviving the Extremes, What Happens to the Body and Mind at Limits of Endurance. And what I have here, when we're using the green text, that is your signal phrase, okay? And I've underlined I've underlined and bolded all of the action verbs for that source. And the blue text that we're going to be using throughout the examples is your summary or your quote or your paraphrase. Okay? And in this case, this is something that Kenneth Calmer claimed, and it's a summary of a chapter. That was his conclusion in a chapter. Okay? He went on and on and on, describing it in great detail. I got it down to very few words. Okay? And then this is the citation for this, and then we have how how the information is relevant to what I'm writing about. Okay, so which in this example fits very well. The author claimed something, and I am casting doubt on it. Okay, so again, your signal phrase can indicate how you are going to treat the source material as well. One thing to notice here is, why did I mention that he's a physician? Why didn't I mention that he's a microsurgeon? Validity. Yeah. Is it really relevant that he's a microsurgeon? Not really, right? It's not relevant to him being up on Mount Everest. I could have mentioned that he's a Mount Everest climber, but that doesn't really give him scientific credibility. It might, if you're talking at REI to a group of mountain climbers, novice mountain climbers, but it doesn't here in academia. And then this is the summary, and I have the footnote is actually in APA in-text citation style. And usually you include the author's name, the year, and if it's a quote, the page number. But I did not have to include the author's name here. I didn't say Calmer 2004 because his name's here. Okay? So if it's in the same sentence like that, you don't want to repeat Calmer 2004. Okay? If I had put the book, the date of the book up in my signal phrase, in Surviving the Extremes, which was published in 2004, physician Kenneth Calmer claimed, blah, 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 I wouldn't even need to put this here because all the source information is there for someone to go back and find it in the bibliography and get all the information. Okay? If I had quoted any of it, I would have to put at least the page number in quotes. All right. So here's another example. This is another book on the same topic. It's called Life at the Extremes, Science of Survival. And it is authored by a professor from Oxford, a physiologist. Notice the press, University of California Press. It's a more credible press than Penguin Books in academia, right? So, and it's 2002. And this is it's a summary or a paraphrase of an observation made by this physiologist. Facial hair growth slows at the same rate in desert-like and near-space conditions. Okay? All right. I have to build around that. That's what I'm incorporating in. I didn't do the research on it. Francis did. So I say, after examining physiological changes in near space, which is a summary of what she did in this chapter, physiology professor Francis Ashcroft concluded that facial hair growth slows. Okay? So I'm sandwiching the signal phrase in between a summary and basically either a summary and another part of the summary, right? So summary information. And then I definitely, even though it's not a quote, I have a footnote at the end, okay? And I tell the reader why I incorporated this. Okay? Maybe, how is this relevant to what I'm studying? And that's always important to do, because your readers don't know what's in your head. You have to spell it out for them. Okay? And here's how the Chicago footnote would look, number 57. It would look like this. Okay? And when I'm taking notes, I have a source file, and I'll put things in quotes, and I'll put the footnote in there so I have it. And then I can go back and I can paraphrase something, but I color code it to say, okay, here was this piece, this last conclusion by Francis, and then I can go back in that file and I can play with paraphrasing and summarizing in that file. When I'm happy with it, I can move it into my master document, the one that I'm writing in. And that way, as long as you mark them, color code or write paraphrase or something to indicate that what you're doing, then you'll know where it came from. So I use Chicago Notes bibliography. If I had cut and pasted or copied and pasted the conclusion of the study, or the last couple sentences in, and then I wanted to paraphrase it or summarize it, I would have had that in quote marks in my source file, and then I would have played around with, and I would have had a footnote with it, and enough information in the footnotes that I would know what it is. Don't have to have everything, but I need to know how to find it, right? Author's name at least, partial title, year. Armed with those, and I can get there. And then I would play around with the words, and then I would also put the footnote, copy the footnote and put it with that source, with my paraphrase. So when I get ready to copy it over, it has the footnote with it, okay? All right, it's the easiest way to do it. You don't get in a lot of trouble if you keep things in a source file, play around with it in there, indicate whether you're paraphrasing or summarizing, and always keep quote marks around things that are quoted.
You're saying your source file, you've got the original, either cut and paste or whatever, in the source file. You play with that in there, you finalize it in your source file, and then you copy it to your master file. Is that what you're saying?
I usually do it that way.
Okay.
I have also taken it. I've cut it out of my source file when I'm writing in my main document, and I go, I need some evidence for this, and I'll go to my source file and I'll find that evidence, and I know that it was quoted, and I'll move it over, but I'll keep quote marks around it, and then I can play with it in the major document. It's safer to play with it, do the initial playing with it in your source file. It's much safer.
The idea, though, is you have to capture the information about what you're going to use. And when you do a straight copy and paste out of something else, a lot of times what happens is you get in a hurry and you don't put the quotes around it and you don't realize where it came from. That's when you start running into trouble. So what Sandy's recommending is a tried and true way of maintaining that. If you develop another way to do it, that's fine. We're not saying you have to use this one, but it is a tried and true way that a lot of people do use. The idea is keep track of your information and try to keep it complete and probably separate until you're ready to import it into your document.
You don't know exactly what you're going to be using. As Greta said, you're looking at a lot of different sources, right? You're not sure which kind of apples you're going to put in your apple pie at first. So you're looking at a number of different options, and then you finally choose, and you taste test each one in your source file basically, and you decide which one will really work for you, and then you move it in. But you keep it in your source file.
So you think that's better than just having like a folder of everything you read and just annotate all the stuff that you read?
You can do that too, but yeah, you can do that in PDFs. You can annotate it, add comments, you can highlight things, etc. But not everything is going to come in a handy PDF. You're going to have books you're looking at. You're going to have most newspapers are online, but you're going to have to save that as a PDF and then go in and mark it. That is a good way to do it. You can do that. But again, I would not incorporate the text into your own until you've decided what you're going to do with it. When I'm organizing my source file, I start putting the information into categories, right, by relevance. And so when Frances is talking about desert conditions and then she's talking about near space conditions, maybe I've organized my work by climate also, climate and altitude. And so I'm going through and as I find different articles, and different studies, different books, etc., I may be putting that information in my source file under desert, near space, okay? And I may have 10 different sources under near space, and I may have 20 under desert. I don't know what I'm going to use yet. I can't put the whole article in there, then it's too cumbersome. So I'm really just picking out what I'm thinking I'm going to use. It's a little less cumbersome. Another point is back up your files. I had a thesis student who got spilled water on his computer, and he was 2 months away, and he had backed up his thesis, but not all his source files onto the cloud. So, and he really needed all those source files. Fortunately, he'd been putting his footnotes religiously into his master document, so he could go back and get those sources, but it was very painful. So.
And the key, there's a lot of different ways to do it. There's a lot of different ways to cook, so you kind of have to come to whatever's going to work most for you. But as you put things in your document, the key is going to be sure to include the citation, even if it's a short citation to remind you to go back and do the complete citation later. Because I've seen people get in trouble where they put something in a chapter and they're happy with it, and then all of a sudden they're starting to move things around, and they think based on location they know exactly where it came from, and then all of a sudden they don't. So you can color code, you can put in brackets. There's a lot of different ways. Books will tell you, your faculty will tell you. Sandy has a lot of experience. What we're trying to help you do is keep track of your sources, what you used, what you're using out of it specifically, so that it is well traced throughout what you're doing. And how you manage it, Sandy's idea is a great idea, but you may like to do something differently. Doesn't matter. It's the combination of those things.
Okay. So let me show you, I want to make the point here in this next slide that you don't have to have a citation after every single every single sentence of someone else's work. Take just a few seconds and read the top paragraph here. The blue is things I've summarized or paraphrased. The black are my own contributions. Okay, so on this first one, I didn't use a signal phrase to indicate who was going to be speaking, but I did use a citation at the end with all the information necessary to refer back to this citation. This is an APA style. The second sentence, why do I not quote that or footnote that? It's my observation. And it's also...
It would probably be sort of common knowledge. And your audience would likely be familiar with fast food chains and would likely know that they use red and yellow.
Yeah, most people would know that fast food chains, they think of McDonald's, Ronald McDonald wearing yellow and red, Kentucky Fried Chicken red, right? Burger King. They all use these bright colors. So if you just start thinking about it, most of the common person wouldn't understand that, even if they don't eat at those establishments. They're out there for us to see, right? Okay, and then we have some results, and then we have a quotation, a summary, and then also a quotation. And notice that I've added the page number in this style when I use a quotation. And then I keep going back. I have one more, and it gets kind of cumbersome to read it if you keep having to read Smith and Jones, right? Okay, so what do we do here is we've gone to 2 citations and 3 signal phrases, which give you the opportunity to mention the caliber of the authors, how credible they are. Here I've mentioned that Smith and Jones are marketing professors and restaurant owners. which is relevant here. If they were Mount Everest climbers, it would not be relevant, right? Okay. And then I can use words like they, something, something. Using a signal phrase here, I can add credibility to their study, to the work, communicate to my reader the credibility by saying they systematically observe something, as opposed to just personal experience, right? So a signal phrase is very powerful for you. I still had to have a quote here because it is a page number. I have to have a citation there because it's a page number. And then I again use these instead of they. These scholars contend. So we can use other words to represent the same audience and indicate who's speaking. Okay? Much easier to read this way, much more friendly. Any questions on that? No?
So that's all style guides adhere to that?
All style guides adhere to that you can do that. If you're as long as your reader knows who was speaking, they're okay. You need to indicate it at the beginning, usually, and then in your language, my last sentence there gives a sense that it is me speaking again. These findings may explain something. So I'm pondering what I just shared, okay? And I could have said, they believe this may explain, right? Then there would be a signal phrase that the authors are saying this still, not me. But by leaving off the they at the beginning, it indicates that it's me. Okay? So just as long, you don't need a citation after every single one, as long as it's clear who's speaking. And you do that with language, with signal phrases. Okay? Okay. All right, quoting. Let's turn to quoting. This is review for most of you, but I know you've been out of school for a while. But we do find that students will, sometimes they'll change a word or two in a quotation because they don't think it's quite the right word. But you need to use exact words with a few exceptions. You can add things into the quote. One of the things you can add in is sick. And it means thus it was written. What you're doing here is you are indicating a typo in the original. Okay? Here we have noted historian Charles Beard argued in 1999 that most of the drafters of the Constitution viewed democracy as something rather to be dreaded than encouraged. And that's a fairly controversial statement, so I quoted it. And I used the word sick here because democracy is spelled incorrectly in the original. I wanted the readers to know I didn't do that, but it wouldn't be proper for me to change their words. Okay? What else is wrong in this sentence that needs a sick? Yeah. So the word then right here should be than. You might feel compelled to change it to than.
Or your word software might want to change it for you.
But the rule is that you leave it as it was, but you indicate that you didn't make the error. Okay? Otherwise, they'll think you typed incorrectly. And then because it's a quote, you have the page number here. You already have the author's name here and the date, so you don't need it at the very end in this style. You also want to, there are a few exceptions. You can use brackets to clarify, to add additions. You don't just add words without putting them in brackets, but they are useful in times. Here's an example. Well into the 19th century, as political scientist Mavis Bachman discovered, the word was repeatedly used by conservatives to smear opponents of all kinds. What is unclear there? What's the word? We don't know what the word is. It's out of context. You will take things out of context and put them in your articles. So what you want to do is you insert the word that they were talking about earlier. The author was talking about earlier to just make sure that it's clear for your reader. Okay? And that's as simple as it is. And because it's a quote in here, you again use the page number. Okay. The other thing is use ellipses. Some styles require, if you take the first couple words off of a sentence, you need to put ellipses, but most citation styles say no, you can start, you just capitalize the first letter and you're good to go. You can start with word 3 and capitalize it, as long as it's a complete sentence, right? And so use ellipses when you drop things in the middle of a sentence. Okay? That's where it's most important. So use them in the middle of a sentence, and use single quotation marks if you're quoting within a quote. Okay? Let me show you how that works. So scientists, this is my credibility angle, scientists from the Centers for Disease Control collected and analyzed DNA samples from 33 wild armadillos in Arkansas, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, where they're sometimes referred to as hillbilly speed bumps because they're often run over by cars. There was a leprosy outbreak in the South last summer. So armadillos linked to leprosy. So it had no author for the article. So I decide I don't want to use this part. I can take that out and put ... I think it just clutters it up and makes it too long. It's not relevant to what I'm doing, the location. Maybe I've mentioned it before, and this sentence is a really good sentence or quote to use, but I don't want to repeat this information. And then, what's the other thing I need to do here?
Change to single quotes around hillbilly speed bumps.
Right. So you need to use, if you're quoting if the original had, hillbilly speed bumps, but it was not quoted in the original, but I've taken the whole sentence out and I've put it in quote marks in my work, and now you have quote marks within quote marks. Not a good thing. So as you say, yes, you have to put single quotes around things that were quoted. What are some of the other words you may want to put quote marks around as a, like, a good one that you may want to put quote marks around are freedom fighters, right? One person's freedom fighters is the other person's terrorists. Okay? Or if China, for instance, has named the Uyghurs in the Northwest as terrorists, other people don't see them as terrorists. It's been used, the 9/11 has been used to crack down on a minority population and dominate them. And so just because China calls them terrorists doesn't mean the rest of the world calls the Uyghurs terrorists. So in that case, you may want to put quote marks around it. Okay?
And if you remember back early in the slides, Sandy was saying when people are speaking, and she's been talking about this is where people are speaking. Well, they're not literally speaking. And so we're just saying hypothetically that they're speaking by way of emphasis to you. Question?
Yeah, so I guess my question, two-part question, is that you're not supposed to use quotations for emphasis, and if you use quotation marks, don't you have to cite it then? Because you're saying it's not your word, so it's coming from somebody else.
So
why does that not require a citation?
if I'm paraphrasing and I'm saying China refers to the Uyghurs as terrorists, I would want to put terrorists in quotes because they use the term, not I. Okay? And it's a controversial term. Hillbilly speed bumps is a very informal term. It's a colloquial, playful word, as opposed to the article is much more academic. So you have a contrast between something that is very informal and something that's formal. You might want to put the quotation marks around it. Doesn't mean that they don't always mean someone. Well, someone was saying them, but we're not saying who.
Let's go back to this. The original, because Sandy's using something that was written somewhere, and she's taking it verbatim, she has to include the whole thing in quotes. And then the rules say because the hillbilly speed bump in their article was a term they were using, and they put the double quotes around it to kind of provide a little emphasis. And so in their case, they were just saying that. She's taking the whole thing, so she has to cite the whole thing. And then the rules say if you have a quote within a quote, then you make it the single quotes. But in their original, they were trying to emphasize that phrase, that kind of playful phrase. They were bringing that out to the reader to say, hey, haha, we call them hillbilly speed bumps here, type of thing.
Sir?
But, okay, but you're not saying if they didn't have hillbilly speed bumps in quotes in the original text, don't be putting
You don't
quotes
need
in
to.
that. That's, you're changing their
Correct.
sentence because they didn't use it in that form.
Correct.
You have to indicate then that you're actually changing it.
Right, so you would not, if they did not put these in the original, you would not put,
Even though you felt that it was.
even though you would not add them in because it's changing the original.
There is an option where you can put it in italics and say emphasis added, so that you are indicating that that's not what they said, but I'm emphasizing it because it helps with my point. But you're distinguishing for the reader what was theirs and where you put a little emphasis in. You wouldn't just add in those quotes.
Yeah, so emphasis added, you often put at the end. If you've italicized something is usually what you do,
Right.
as opposed to putting it around quote marks. Because you don't want your reader to be confused about what's a quote and what's not a quote. But if the Chinese are calling the Uyghurs terrorists, but most of the world sees them as freedom fighters or oppressed minorities, then it's a controversial term, right? So, sir.
I just had a question. It doesn't really pertain to the full quote. Just another question I had, kind of with paraphrasing in regard to the lists.
Mm-hmm.
So, say you truncated the rest of your quote at the end of Texas, right? I mean, do you really have to quote? I mean, that will still show up in the plagiarism software as a lot of words match together. But are you really going to quote a list like 33 wild armadillos in Arkansas, Alabama, Louisiana? Because there's only so many ways you can really write that,
Right.
without making it awkward. So
Right.
you need to quote that if it's just some simple phrasing.
And sometimes there is leeway given for lists.
Okay.
So, and this list is in alphabetical order, which is what journalists usually do, to not give favoritism to one state over another. So it would be, using the word wild is about the only deviation they've given here. Someone else might say feral armadillos, because there are pets. But yeah, you could have this in there. It's not so unique. So when someone's analyzing a Turnitin report, they'll say, is that really a unique sentence? Even though you have more words, but it's not really a unique sentence. If you stop it here, it's not, from here to here, it's not very unique.
Okay.
And you'd be okay.
So you can
It's a
just write
judgment
that
call.
without quoting it or anything.
Yeah,
Okay.
you could. But this other makes it unique. It's the combination of phrases that one person is very unlikely to do it exactly the same way. So think about that when you're writing.
Okay.
I guess, but if you're using the exact words from the author, then doesn't it has to be in quotation? Because it's not. I understand Arkansas. Well, those are factual places. They're facts, if you can say that. But
Well,
it's like using common knowledge. If you use common knowledge, the exact verbatim common knowledge, doesn't that have to be
Yes.
in quotation marks?
Well, but the
So-
point here is the use of the ellipses. You're indicating to the reader there was additional information. Everything else is exact. There was additional information, but it wasn't really necessary for the point I was making.
I'm not arguing the use of ellipses. I understand that part. I'm just, I guess, specific to his question and the fact that, hey, Arkansas, Alabama, the states, those are states, but if it's part of the phrase or the language that the author used, then my understanding is that it has to be inside quotation marks.
It should be inside quotation marks, but if it's something that is so commonly said, like President Obama, Barack Obama has been president since 2008. You can find that almost anywhere. The moon rises in the east. It's short. Many of us say that. It's common knowledge, so you don't really need to quote it. This is not common knowledge, and it is specifying, if you stopped it at Texas, it is specifying where this takes place and that they did a study there, and that's not common knowledge. But is it quote-worthy, right? Or would it be fairly uncommon that many people might say, they tested 33 wild armadillos in these states? Or personnel in Arkansas, Alabama, Louisiana, took samples from wild armadillos. So then you switched it, and you'd be okay. If I was going to take this, I would put quote marks around it, or I would paraphrase it, and I'd put the states before the wild armadillos. Right? That's what I would do, because then I wouldn't be caught. But the chances are that someone else might say exactly this. You're kind of weighing that. Would someone say that exactly?
To this point, if it's exactly what you read, even though you're taking pieces out, the whole thing's, it seems like it's common knowledge, or it's very likely there's not many words that can change that. We should do it anyways from an ethical standpoint. Just do it, and if you overquote, so what? It just gets a little annoying. It may not be the best reading. You're protecting yourself from.
Yeah. It would probably be best to quote that, because in one case it's not common knowledge, right? So I do agree with you that it would be best to quote it, even if you're going from here to here, or paraphrase it. And it is hard to paraphrase, but you could. So, okay. Quoting. Yes, you can overquote, but just keep these rules in mind. You don't want more than about 10% of your paper to be quotes. The rest you want to be paraphrased or your own, or summarized, or be your own original contributions. You don't want to lump a bunch of quotes together without analyzing each one and why you're bringing them into the paper. You have to tell your reader their significance each time. You don't want to use one source too many times, especially if you're quoting, because that's going to lower your credibility. You want a variety of sources. And you need a good reason to quote. Not wanting to paraphrase is not a good reason. Okay. Definitions are often quoted. Okay. Even if they seem to be field-specific common knowledge, everyone says this about. But if it is a definition that people have slaved over to make those words just so, and if you took one of the words out, it would be wrong, that means you had to look it up somewhere to make sure it was right, and therefore you should quote it. Okay. So legally binding words, expert declarations, historic importance. So think about when you're incorporating something in. Okay, it does need to have punch, basically. So here, yes.
The definitions, I mean, does that mean you have to cite like equations, things like that? I mean, because you have to look that up to most of the times.
Equations usually have a footnote after them.
Even if it's in most standard textbooks, if it's like B equals IR.
No.
Something like that.
If it's field-specific common knowledge, E equals MC squared.
Yeah.
You don't have to cite that. It's common. That's common for most people, but it's certainly common for physics and many other fields. But yes, you wouldn't need to. It's very common ones. Is it a common definition? Is it a common formula or equation? If it's not, if it's fairly unique and used in a narrow way, you definitely want to cite an equation. Okay. Okay. So when quoting, this is an example of vivid language from a quote by Mao Zedong, and who was a leader of communist China from 1949 to the mid 70s when he passed away. And I'm indicating that that his parts of his speech were in this work by Wiley and Huffington by saying "in," right? Because I'm not quoting the direct speech. I'm quoting a source that had the speech written down, and it's translated because he obviously said it in Chinese, not in English. But the book has it written this way: "Never again will the people of China be enslaved." I could say Mao Zedong once said, but it doesn't really fit, right, with the power of the statement. So I add context to help my readers understand the importance of the words. I say when he said it, I said what the context was, and I used verbs like he proclaimed and he shouted. Okay? And maybe I understand that he shouted because of what Wiley and Huffington reported, or maybe I'm adding that in because I actually heard the speech. I can't understand the words, but it was a really jarring speech. And you can get them on YouTube now. So you can hear the energy and the anger and the fervor behind it. So knowing that he's shouting, you can definitely hear that. So that is a little more lively than this. Helps your reader understand, okay? And then you can indicate that what they did not say, in this case, Chairman Mao did not elaborate in his speech. And that can be important too. And then these are things that I'm talking about that I know about. The theory says, yeah, China thought they were enslaved by Western powers. They thought they were enslaved by Japan. They were enslaved by capitalists, feudal lords. They had all kinds of different narratives about who was enslaving them. And they actually use the narratives today. So I tie it back into why it's important. Okay? So notice that very little of this is the blue text, the quote itself. There's a lot of signal phrase, and there's a lot of my own analysis. Okay. All right, so summarizing and paraphrasing. Many words to few, and paraphrasing is keeping it about the same size. You tend not to want more than 4 or 5 unique words in a row. Okay. Try to change it up as much as you can. And you're going from complex and detailed to generalized. And just like the Osama bin Laden book, many, many details in that. But you want to have a 2-sentence synopsis of it. Okay? That would be very generalized. No detail at all. So, and then just make the details clearer or more relevant when you paraphrase. Okay. So how do you do it? Mainly you have to read it actively, try to understand it. Write down, take notes in your own words. What do you think this means? So if you have the quote up above and you want to paraphrase it, you're going, it seems to be this, right? This seems to be important. What are the main points that seem to be made? Just put them in your own language. Just, you're not thinking about appropriateness of words or anything. Just trying to communicate what was said accurately. And note some key words that you may want to keep. And then working from your notes, not from the original, then working from your notes, write up a summary. Okay? And that way you keep, it will be most likely in your own style. Paraphrasing, very similar. Instead of main points, you're talking about key points and details that are important. And importantly, you're making sure that you alter the structure and focus of the sentence, whereas you're changing phrases around, subjects and objects, and using synonyms as much as you can. Sometimes you have to keep the same word, of course. Both of these, you want to make sure that you check back, read your paraphrase out loud, look at the quote, and decide if you got it right. Okay?
I always thought like just using synonyms and changing the order of words and things like that, and I thought that was still plagiarism or something.
I'll show you. We're almost there. So this is a good example of taking a 128-page book and boiling it down to 38 words. I could not put the whole book in my article. It wouldn't fit. Why did I add that? Why did I note that he's a security studies scholar and a retired French military officer?
Put context to his opinion, it gives him credibility.
Yeah,
And
it
shows his authority on the topic.
shows his authority, gives him some credibility, shows his relevance. How much does he really know? Was he just a tourist living in Algeria, right? And took notes, or a business person living in Algeria and he wrote a memoir? No, he was actually a serious scholar and a military officer. If he was just a scholar, he would not have as much credibility as a military officer who probably took part in operations in Algeria, for instance. So this is my summary of his 128-page book. And why did I put punish severely and even publicly in quotes? Why didn't I just change that?
Because you liked his wording.
It has to be more than a preference, but yes, maybe because I liked his wording. It's a pretty controversial statement.
Pretty strong statement.
Very strong statement by him, a very strong recommendation, a very controversial one. And so, since it is controversial, I want to make sure that I communicating it as he did. So there's no chance of me having, toned it down or toned it up, right? So this severely, publicly, I don't really want to change his words. Okay. Now we're going to get to your question about how, can you just change a few words and are you done? No. Here is from a honor board case. From the original source was the inconspicuous, efficient, and cheap surveillance method that drones provides raises a very similar issue to that seen in United States v. James, which is a law. It's in italics because it's a law. Court case, excuse me. It was paraphrased this way, so it could avoid Turnitin catching it. Drop the word inconspicuous, change cheap to inexpensive, change drones to UAS, and then you had to add the S, and then change to that scene to argued. And put a citation at the end, and the argument was, well, I cited it, isn't it okay? No, it's not okay because the words, the organization, the style is the same as the original. Okay? And Turnitin will catch this. It will catch it.
So what if you start by saying something like, in the United States versus Jones, it was argued that blah, blah, blah.
That's exactly what you want to do. So this is here's a insufficient paraphrase again. What did they do here? Then I'll show you how to do a good one. Change, for example, in addition. Go. Drones to UASs. This one was really pathetic. This one they put a little more effort into it. This one, not at all. Okay, and there was no citation at all either. Okay. A well-written paraphrase would change the subject. So we've changed quite a few things in this paraphrase. So the EPA has come to the forefront now. Before it was just kind of dangling there, and the focus was on the Farmers' Privacy Act. And the other thing I did was, they say restricts their ability. And here we're talking about having less power, operating with less power. Those are very similar, right? similar in meaning, but different words, my own words. And here is talking about surveillance drones, and it's talking about in agriculture monitoring, and here it's talking about monitoring, okay, to monitor. So again, you can use some of the same words, but they're in quite a bit of different order, okay? So,
How can you be sure that you're not changing the spirit of the original text with what you're doing? I mean, you're changing it a bit, and that kind of changes the emphasis, and that seems to me to kind of change the meaning or the intent behind the original. How can you be sure that your restating it is not?
depends on how you're using the information. So I may be writing a book about the EPA. And so I always want to keep the EPA as a subject. I find something that mentions the EPA, but that was not the subject of the article. The subject of the article was about various laws that restrict private citizens' ability to do whatever they want to do. It's about regulation. And this was one example they used. Well, this is a fact. It is a piece of data. It's not common knowledge. But I want to change it, keep the meaning the same, but change the emphasis because my emphasis is different. I'm focused on the EPA. So it is a delicate balance, and that's why the fourth step is always to make sure that you check it, you're paraphrasing and summarizing against the original to get a sense of whether you kept the intent or whether you manipulated the data. Okay? That's why you want to put controversial statements in quote marks when you can, even if it's just part of your summary or paraphrase, because those are pretty controversial statements. You want to have kind of the way they had them.
If you were to take that statement and say the EPA is now powerless to monitor, that's a different change from what their meaning was. So it's partly your intent versus their intent, and did you completely change the meaning? And when you're paraphrasing, the idea isn't to change the meaning, it's to put it in your own words so that it flows with how you write, how you speak, your voice. But the key is, remember when I had that slide up that said there were 3 different ways to do things, 3 rules, 1 formula? Same thing applies every time. Whether you quote, you summarize, or you paraphrase, you always have to give credit to where it's from. But in that case, it's you need to go back and say, did I completely change the meaning? Not the emphasis, but the meaning of what they said. And if I did, then I need to change it again.
Yeah.
So what you're also saying, though, in the first case is if you can't rewrite it with your own words, your own brain, just quote it.
Yes.
Because
You want
you're
it.
much in trouble, even if that was an attempt, as pathetic as it looks, an attempt to rewrite it in their own words.
Right.
Just put quotes on it and move on.
Right, just put quotes on it and move on. Put a signal phrase and then add the quote. That's cool. But remember, you want to have a good reason to quote. And most things you can change. It takes time, and when you're researching, another reason you want to cut and paste into a source file and put quotes around something is you don't want to necessarily stop and paraphrase because it can take effort. So you go, okay, that looks like it's going to be valuable. You stick it in there. And later, when you actually go back and read it and you say, yeah, I want to use this section of that paragraph, it's a really valuable piece of data for me, I'm going to paraphrase it. And then that's when you start working with the words, okay?
Yeah, and go back to Sandy's slide before where it said, because you don't want to paraphrase or you can't figure out or you're too lazy is not a good reason to quote. So and that's part of what the point of this is and what we're about to do is help you practice. Because it does take a little bit of practice to figure out how to do it and do it well.
Okay, so exercise 1. We have 2 exercises for you, and this is to help you paraphrase. The first exercise is a simpler sentence than the second one. And you want to make sure that you understand the sentence and you want to put it into your own words. Here's what I ended up doing. The Delphi technique was developed, that's the original. I want to understand it. This one was restructured. Put the forecasting at the front, forecast the impact of technology on warfare. Rand Corporation developed the Delphi technique in the 1950s. This is still too close to the original. For one thing, I have this is many more than 4 words in a row. And I'm saying the Rand Corporation developed as opposed to X was developed by Rand. Those are very, very similar. You can use synonyms. You can change the structure and emphasis a little, and then go through and figure out where might I use some synonyms instead, but still keep the meaning. This is when it's really hard and you're really struggling to paraphrase. Then you can switch phrases around and then work on synonym replacement and check whether it matches, whether the meaning holds true. So, did I retain the meaning and the important details? So in this one, instead of to forecast the impact of technology, I said to predict technology's effects. And I could have said on something besides warfare, another word for warfare, but that worked. The Rand Corporation created. Now, Delphi technique is not capitalized here, so it's not an official. The Delphi is the important part. It can be a technique, a method, a process, right? If this was capitalized, I wouldn't change it. But here, I could change it to method because it's just another way of saying method, technique, etc., process. So, and then I changed it to within a decade after World War II. Again, they were not precise in there. They said in the 1950s. Okay. So if I know what happened in 1954, I'm still within the decade after World War II, right? Again, it changes it up. And maybe in mine, maybe it's important that we're talking about what happened in the decade after World War II. I don't know. You will when you're writing your paper. Okay. Do you guys want to do the second one and then we'll quit? Okay. Let me show you what I did. So again, I had to understand it. And in this time, I wrote down keywords. It was a pretty complex, longer sentence than the first one, so I wrote down keywords. Might want to use these. Future security threats, predicting, rapid change, prepare. Okay, what of those are important to me? And then I thought about that and tried to put it into a sentence. So I had a signal phrase, as some of you did. You said according to. So in a recent speech, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff described, so I made him the subject. He described a security environment that will change rapidly, making new threats difficult to predict and requiring exceptionally well-prepared U.S. military. Completely different than the rest of yours, which is fine. I tried to, in this example, incorporate pretty much everything he said, but I could have I could have stopped it here. I could have stopped it after the word predict. And I could have even broke it into 2 sentences if there are 2 main concepts that he's covering. Okay? All right. And then, of course, I had to check the meaning, and I had to add the citation. Okay. We're going to stop because it's late, but we have some handouts for you, and we're going to send the slides tonight. here are some exercises you can do on your own. There was a National Military Strategy released last May, and it is this document here, National Military Strategy, and it is available online. And there was a press release about it, and there was actually a recording of the speech where Dempsey, who was then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, gave a speech announcing the new military strategy. Okay, so this article was written by Jim Garmon, and this is the intro to it. And what we're going to give you are each of you. I think there's enough that they can each take one of each. They broke it down. This is just the introduction. They broke it down into four main sections. And strategic outlook, globalization, concerns about rogue states, and China. Okay? And the exercise is, one, you need to know what your thesis is. So I made one up. That's the same for all of these. But go through and take each of these and try to quote the blue text. Try to paraphrase a sentence. These are basically short sentences or paragraphs. Take one. Take one of these and paraphrase it, just as you did with the other text. And then look at the article as a whole, write down key words and ideas in your own words, and make a summary. You don't have to read a whole 128-page book to practice summarizing. You can take something like this. What was the main point about this section? Okay? And then, so each one of those, and we have the formula here for you, and you'll want to pay attention to who is speaking. Is it coming from Jim Garmon? Is it coming from the strategy? Is it coming from the speech? Is it coming from the press release? Okay? So you want to pay attention to those. And so this one's pretty complicated. And then we have some examples of this. We have some more quoting examples and paraphrasing examples, and how we carried those out. So more complicated.
We'll start one step, but they'll be in the slides when we send them to you.
Yeah. So okay. So if you have questions as you're going along, if you get stuck, let us know. We're here to help. The coaches are here to help. They can check your sentences against the original and see if they think the meaning was the same. So let us know what we can do. Okay? Okay. I hope it was helpful.
Thank you.